and welcome to a brand new video. Today we have quite an interesting new mysterious case. I have so much to tell you about it, so get comfortable, grab something to eat because it's going to be very cool. But before we begin, don't forget to follow me on my social media. You know I have a billion social media accounts, and the most important thing is to subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell so it lets you know when I upload a video. Very well, without anything else to say, let's begin. The case of Leonarda Cianciulli. Leonarda Cianciulli was born in Montella in Italy on November 14, 1893. Her parents were Emilia and Mariano Cianciulli. But before we begin with Leonarda's story in itself, I want to tell you a little bit about her family and especially about her mom, so you can get to know some of the context of her life and also the historical context they were living in. It was the 19th century, and I know that many of you know how they thought back then. The culture was quite different in those times. The ideals, the philosophy, the religious topics, among many other things, greatly influenced people's perspective of the world and the way they act in the society. For example, the natality rate was quite different to the one we have right now. People lived around 45 years and the babies had a high mortality rate. They often got illnesses or they were diseases that didn't have a treatment back then. So many babies and many children died on those times. And in general, people didn't live as long as they do now. Back then, society was evidently a very sexist one, and let's say that a woman could only do certain type of things. For example, they were allowed to create art or creative things, to play the piano, make music, also to sing, and they were obviously also prepared to be housewives. This is obviously only regarding high-class women, not lower-class ones, for they basically only had the chance of becoming housewives. And all these things these other women study, the high-class ones, were in preparation for living a life with their husbands. And basically what happened when they were very young, for they didn't live as long as I mentioned, was that they were in a rush to get married. So when they were very young, they were probably taken to some balls or some reunions where they could meet some suitors. Eventually, their family chose the suitor as her future husband. And Emilia, Leonardo's mom, lived through this historical moment. She basically was a high-class girl, and her parents started taking her to balls to see if she got any suitors so she could eventually marry. They couldn't be alone at any moment on those parties. It was against the law, so to speak, and it didn't look good to leave them alone with the suitor, so they had to be constantly chaperoned. One day, the mom of Leonarda was requested for a ball, and unlike the other times, she told her parents she wanted to go back home alone. And that's how she, when it ended, started heading to her home. However, what she didn't know was that not only the suitor she danced with that night would be after her, but also other people were watching her. And that's when Mariano appeared, which was a man many knew because he was a lazy man, he didn't do many things, and he spent his time drinking and didn't do anything productive with his life. So that night, he started following Emilia, and he led her to some kind of stables in an area where there wasn't obviously many people. It's somewhat complicated to discuss this topic nowadays, for obviously many will say that his motives were clear, but actually for that time, and especially a girl like Emilia, she just didn't know. She didn't know anything about sexual topics, for back then they couldn't be intimate until marriage. And they weren't told about that until it happened after the marriage, the wedding night. And when the moment came, they didn't even know. So she basically went to this place with this man, trusting him, and eventually he obviously physically abused her. She actually didn't understand what happened until many years later. After she was abused by this man, she stayed in that place for a whole day, barely able to stand because of the pain that experience had inflicted in her. This man carried on normally. Later, she went to her house and stayed in her room. She was still in pain, but she didn't say anything to anybody because she was afraid of her parents' judgment for having walked with a suitor completely alone because that was very frowned upon. And some months passed and she didn't get, obviously, her period. Back then, it was easier for people to notice this kind of things because as she was a high-class woman, back then there weren't sanitary towels, tampons, or anything like that. But they used some reusable towels, like so to call them. And they were washed many times, so the cleaning ladies started noticing that for several months she didn't use them. And they obviously started talking to the mom, and that's when she asked Emilia for an explanation. She ended up telling them the story of what she lived through that night. And then they realized she ended up pregnant because of that man. But because appearances were also an important thing, they decided they needed to avoid losing both the family and her daughter's honor. So they forced her to marry the man that had abused her. And you can imagine what kind of relationship they had. He was also a man who was older than her, that had been previously married, and that had a custom of drinking all the time. And he also abused her not only in that way, but also physically, for he hit her, and verbally, for he constantly reprimanded her if she didn't do what he wanted. It was something very hard for her, especially for having to live with the person who abused her and left her pregnant. And so many months passed, and eventually she had a daughter, which obviously had consequences. Her daughter became like a person she didn't want to recognize, that she didn't want to love. It was very painful for her to see her and to have that mother-daughter relationship, so she never gave her the love of a normal mother. She also mistreated her in many ways, physically and verbally. She told her she wasn't enough and that she ruined her life. And that was how the girl was raised, little by little, with abuses, with an absent mother, and an ever more absent father. One day, the father didn't come back home at night, and let's say that this was like normal. He didn't come back often, but when several days passed, her mother started to try to understand what was happening. So she went to town searching for her husband, and she found him at a friend's house, feverish and in coma. The only thing she did was leave, and in the end, she didn't care if he was still alive or not. And actually, one of her biggest dreams was becoming a widow. Leonarda said in her memoir that she didn't remember much of that time, but that she remembered how her dad was regarding some things, that he was violent among other things. But she also remembered that the day of her father's funeral, for he died after that disease he caught, she remembered that her mother even spat on his casket when he was being buried. When Emilia went back to her family, to her parents, looking for support after all this that happened, her parents rejected her completely. It was a dishonor that she didn't have a husband. And she had a husband that abused her, a daughter that was the product of that abuse, so she basically had to build her life alone again with her daughter. Then she started living again, the whole going out with men thing, of going to balls, of meeting and having many suitors. The problem was that those men weren't perceiving her as a wife material anymore, especially because she had a daughter and because she was a widow. So they just used her for a while, and eventually she got tired of this too. So she started looking for men with other intentions, and she ended up with a man that did well, but he was part of the organized crime. This man started to change many habits this woman had. She stopped taking care of her daughter, and they left Leonarda alone all the time. They were to have fun one place to the other, but leaving Leonarda alone. They didn't even give her food, so she almost had to survive completely alone, searching for her own food. All these problems I'm telling you about obviously led Leonarda to a very difficult situation. When she was only 13 years old, she had her first suicide attempt, which wasn't successful. She tried to hang herself with sheets. However, she didn't make it, and something that was very shocking in that moment was that the mother didn't even realize she had tried to kill herself. Leonarda couldn't speak for several days because she hurt badly her vocal cords with that attempt of suicide, and the mother didn't even notice and didn't pay attention to her. A year later, she tried again and didn't make it either. So she carried on with her life, and eventually she also got to the moment her mother had already lived, the looking for men. So her mother said, well, Leonarda may be the one to change our lives if we get her a good husband. So she started with the same routine of searching for men for her and taking her to balls. He was a very solicited girl, and all the men wanted to be with her, but she basically didn't connect. It was later, in 1917, when she ended up marrying a registry office clerk who wasn't a high-class person, called Raphael Pensandri. Her parents obviously didn't approve of her marriage, and it is said that this situation led Leonarda's mother to curse them. Basically, she told her that she wouldn't have any success in her life, nor in the things she would do for deciding to marry that man. And here's when a part of Leonarda's life began, in which she started, for example, getting very attached to the Romanis' beliefs. The Romanis, I don't know if you know, but they have a culture that has a little more supernatural beliefs, especially. They are superstitious and they do palm readings, they see the future, predictions, among other things. And so she started to get a lot into that culture because eventually they moved to an area where many people who had those beliefs lived in. They are also nomadic from one place to another, and this made her start to believe more and more in that curse and in that evil eye her mother has casted against her. She began feeling very anxious about that thing with her mother, so she decided to go to one of those Romanis she knew, so she could do a reading and tell her somehow about her future and if he had or not the curse that her mother casted. She asked the witch that was reading her palm if she was going to die. The witch told her she wasn't, that she wouldn't die for a long time, but that she was going to live a long and a sad life, especially regarding her children. This obviously started to be a problem for her. Her biggest dream was to have a family. It is very common for people who suffered from abuses from their family when they are very young to have these issues. Later, they try to have children and create a family again because they don't want to relive in any way what they lived, and they wanted to create a nice kind of love. She had this dream and they obviously started trying to have kids, and for a good while they couldn't, until she finally had her first son. They moved to the city of Lauria in 1921. And let's say that there, her husband managed to get a job quickly and they started living this new life with their baby. She also started to get pregnant very often, and she even had 17 children in total. But different things began to happen. She started losing some during pregnancy, and then she lost others before they were 3 years old. In total, 13 of her children ended up dying and 4 were alive. So you can imagine how difficult was the situation for her. But with those losses, she started seeing some patterns and having some attitudes of a mom who was afraid of losing her children. In 1922, one of her children was born and he became the most precious son. He was called Giuseppe and she started to protect him a lot with the fear of losing him. She didn't let him go to play or do any other things. She was the typical mom who was very anxious and got up every 5 minutes in the middle of the night to see if his son was still breathing. And if she didn't feel him breathing, she moved him to see if he was still alive. If he had a fever, she already thought he was going to die. So that was a very difficult situation, and the overprotection was huge because she didn't want to lose any more children. She was thinking her mom's curse was real. This attitude she had obviously brought her very powerful pains to herself and some very serious health problems. She started suffering some sort of seizures which were caused by a part of the brain because of the stress. So she had some difficulties taking care of her children too. She was afraid to take care of them because she could have a seizure, an attack, and she could let them fall and die. I mean, it was a very delicate chain reaction. Despite everything, they had several children and they needed money. Maintaining children was something very difficult for them, so they managed to find her a job in the same bank her husband worked at. This time they found her a job as a part of the cleaning staff. And let's say that they found her a position in which she could take care of her children without distressing. The idea was that she would clean the bank at night so she could have the rest of the day available for her children. That's when she got familiar with some chemicals, and this cleaning job started teaching her some things. She did some mixes, she saw that she could clean, she started having certain knowledge related to the chemical stuff. However, one of those days when she was working, one of his children died at night. Again, surprisingly, almost all of them died like that without apparent reason. The doctors couldn't find an explanation for why these things happened. And one of those nights, one of them died, and they didn't tell her anything until she went back home. When she arrived, it was obviously something very hard for her. And she started developing a very big obsession and said well, the solution to this problem is going to be the money. For if I had a lot of money, I could give them a decent life and they wouldn't die, so I could pay for a lot of things that can't do right now. She then created a fake account and a movement to go to a bank and withdraw some cash. The bank obviously told her ma'am, not even you can believe this. And they basically arrested her for account fraud, and she ended up in jail for a year and a half. After she was released from prison, she went back to her family to see her children, specifically to his husband's family because they love her very much. However, they were ashamed of her and what she did, you know what I told you. In that moment, reputation and name were extremely important, so they basically completely shunned her, and so she decided to move to the countryside. In that place she lived, she started getting very close again to another group of Romanis who began teaching her many other things. She already felt that connection with them, so that new relationship was immediate again. But this same time she decided to dive deeper into their world for them to teach her palm readings, predictions, and how to work those gifts she may had. However, the place in which they lived in that moment, which was Lacedonia, was hit with an earthquake in 1930 that destroyed almost everything in the city, including her house. So it was one of those fates that made her say this curse have upon me is affecting me in every possible way. Then they moved to Correggio, where they lived for a long time. She started to build a life again, for when all this happened she lost her children, her home, so she decided that it was probably the moment to have something stable, something problem-free, for she expected her luck to turn. And it was like that for a long time. She started to get on really well with some people, the townspeople knew her, liked her, and thought well of her. And by that time, to support herself, she decided to create her own store. As she already knew, as I've told you, a little about chemical mixes because of the job she had, she started producing her own soaps, and she became really popular. Obviously, many people, especially high-class people, started buying a lot from her store. Besides that, she started offering many services to those high-born ladies that came there, such as predictions and palm readings. So she started having afternoon teas with her customers, attending them and talking about their own futures. She predicted some things for them and all that. She became a very respected woman among the Romani community. They even consider her a Romani, and she even started getting very deep into those supernatural aspects. She read a lot of books, things about potions, things about black magic, white magic, and everything. And that's how she found some thoughts about how to maybe break that curse that her mom has casted on her. By that time, in 1939, her son Giuseppe was one of the closest to her. As I told you, she overprotected him a lot, but he enlisted in the Italian army fight the Second World War. She obviously got the biggest fright of her life and say I won't lose my son in this war. So she started reading this book to be able to break this curse. And she found that probably the best thing to battle dark magic was to get into the dark world too. So she thought for herself that the best way to erase that curse somehow was killing or making a sacrifice. And that's when Faustina Seti appeared. She was one of the clients that got to her store for the future readings, looking for some answers to questions that she had. She was specifically an older woman that was looking for a new husband. In that moment, what Leonarda did was tell her that she found her a perfect husband in a city called Paula, and that she would have to go there and meet him. But she couldn't tell anyone about this specific plan. Besides, she insisted her to write several letters to her family members and friends, telling them she was going to Paula for a man, but she couldn't give them more explanations. Before leaving for Paula the same day she would go there, she decided to visit Leonarda again to get some encouraging words, for she was nervous for embarking in this new project. Then Leonarda offered her a wine that contained a sleeping potion, and then Faustina was left on the floor completely unconscious. While she slept, this woman took an axe and then killed Faustina. You can imagine the scene. I don't want to go into details, but what she did was cut her into pieces to be able to store her in a closet, and besides, she kept her blood in a bowl. She eventually used it to produce her own soaps and some tea. This is very complicated. It's obviously a little, when I was researching this, I was very shocked. I don't even know how could you make a soap with that. But basically, when this woman wrote her memoir later, she left an entry that said, "I threw the pieces into a pot, added 7 kilos of caustic soda, which I had bought to make soap, and stirred the mixture until the pieces dissolved in a thick, dark mush that I poured into several buckets and emptied in a nearby septic tank. As for the blood in the basin, I waited until it had coagulated, dried it in the oven, ground it and mixed it with flour, sugar, chocolate, milk, and eggs, as well as a bit of margarine, kneading all the ingredients together. I made lots of crunchy tea cakes and served them to the ladies who came to visit." You know how she had these meetings with the woman that normally went to read her to get her palms read by her, something like that? And she invited them all the tea and crunchy cakes? So you can imagine what they were consuming. Besides that, she stole the money and all the belongings from that woman she killed. This started being like a sacrifice. Remember that these women weren't people she had a problem with. They weren't evil or anything like that. They were random people she chose and thought could be the perfect for the crime. Then it came a moment in which she felt magic was not working because his son still wanted to go to fight in the war. So she decided to make some changes in that moment regarding her crimes. That's when Francesca Soavi came, another client that was looking for a job. Leonarda told her that, she found her a job at a girls' school in a city called Piacenza, and that she had to go there, same as the other girl. She told her that she had to write letters to her family members, telling them she was going someplace else, but she couldn't give them explanations. Francesca also went that afternoon before changing her life to say goodbye, and she'd ended up sharing the same awful fate that Faustina. Exactly the same thing happened. She ended up using the same ingredients and chemicals and did the same thing to her. But this time she gave her the soap she made out of Francesca's body to her son so he could scrub. She believed that using the sacrifice in that way, with him using it directly, would prevent him from going away. Also, all this happened at the same time she kept selling those soaps in her own store, so you can imagine how many people scrubbed with those women's bodies. But she kept thinking that her magic hadn't worked, and so her third victim came. Her name was Virginia Cacioppo. This was a very particular victim because she felt the sacrifice had to be a tier higher. This girl was very renowned in the city, and she could be considered a celebrity because she was an opera singer. Many people knew her too. She was very loved by everyone, and she had a very nice life. She went to consult her precisely regarding the job topic, if she should continue there, if she should take her success elsewhere, among many other things. Again, she promised her a job, and the morning she was supposed to go to that other town, she visited Leonarda too. And the same thing happened, a wine with a sleeping potion, and she fell asleep, meeting again her awful fate. However, this time, unlike the others, She told her son Giuseppe that she had to bathe him herself with this soap that she made. Obviously, he didn't know anything about that. He found that weird, but she told him, "This is the only way in which I can remove the curse of my family upon you." And so the days passed. Let's say that this woman went away with it and no one was asking about the first victims until Virginia. As I told you, she had the particularity that she was renowned. So back then, her sister-in-law started feeling her absence. She said like, "I don't understand why she didn't come back home. We don't know anything about her." But she had seen her sister-in-law going with to Leonardo's store in the days she was last seen. The police obviously interviewed Leonarda, but the woman seemed innocent. She was an old woman with a lot of illnesses, and she said that she didn't know anything and that she had gone there, but that she had many clients that come and went, and she had no idea. Back then, the police brought Giuseppe in to give a statement, but when Leonardo saw that Giuseppe could be in danger, she decided to confess to all her crimes immediately. She said the following: "I don't want my son to come to my questioning. I will tell you what you want. Sentence me too, but my son is innocent. I don't want him to hear me." At first, the police didn't believe her. They say like, "This woman is clearly covering for her son. How it is possible that she was capable of cutting those bodies and leaving them like that?" But she explained to them how she had done that and the expertise she had, especially regarding chemicals. In the end, they were able to prove that she had been the author of those crimes, becoming one of the most important serial killers in the history of Italy. She was declared guilty of the crimes and sentenced to 30 years of prison and 3 years in a psychiatric hospital. However, on October 15, 1970, she died in the asylum just 1 year before her release. She suffered a stroke and some investigations were done later in which they found out that the chemicals she had been using, the caustic sodas and among other things, caused her brain to completely malfunction. So it was a miracle that she survived for so many years. But obviously what she used during that time greatly affected her and led her to death. Her body was turned to her family and they had a funeral. And the things she used to commit her crimes are now in Rome's Criminology Museum in Italy. You can find those things so people know a little bit about this story. Let's say that putting this in today's context, many doctors have made a psychiatric eval, and they say that it was evident that Leonarda suffered of a clinical depression and anxiety, which were never treated and thus led her to that state. She was basically crazy when she talked to people, she was very delirious. She talked a lot about her children, about things in the past, in the present. Many people say that if she had gone through a medical exam or some kind of modern medical treatment, she could have been exonerated from that terrible situation. But anyway, guys, that was the case. It was very particular and different. I think I told it to you with more empathy regarding the story, but there are many serial killers that have very similar stories. That doesn't mean I condone the fact that she killed those women, but I wanted to give you context, especially because of the historical time we were talking about, which is very different than the one of this time. So yeah, it's a very different case. The thing about the soaps especially was very, very curious to me. How could she go to such lengths to protect her own children? Imagine the level of desolation, of pain, of sadness after losing 13 children. I mean, that's a lot of people. I think that is just a very sad story of moments of bad guidance, of her thinking that she was going to be doomed her whole life. And in the end, it seems that her mother's curse was active even after she died. But anyway, I leave this video here. If you like it, don't forget to leave the like, comment what you feel, what you think of this very particular case. Don't forget to follow me in all my social media, and the most important thing is to subscribe to this channel and to activate the notification bell so it lets you know when I upload a new video. Thank you so much for watching me, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!